When you have fertile soil and no plants planted, nature produces weeds to fill the vacuum. When you have an environment that produces abuse and lack the skill to heal it, abuse ripples out in a virus. And it's useful to understand the environment, the recipe, so to speak, that leads to self-harm. And so that's what we're going to go into. So the first part of the environment is the prioritization hierarchy of an individual being hurt, being traumatized. And number one is gaining a sense of agency and control. And number two is pain mitigation, meaning that on balance, the individuals that our culture produces would rather be in pain and have a sense of control and agency than they would be in less pain and feel completely helpless about it. And this is particularly true when less pain is a somewhat intolerable level of pain. Meaning once pain reaches a threshold of feeling somewhat intolerable, feeling helpless and without any control in an intolerable level of pain produces the number one prioritization of gaining a sense of power, agency, and control, even if that means increasing the pain. So that's the first part of this environment, inside. And this environment inside, this prioritization of gaining a sense of control, dovetails with cultural chauvinism that in the masculine chauvinism stigmatizes people who are in a helpless state and deifies or respects people who are in a state of control, in a state of mastery. So when you have an environment that shames not knowing, feeling helpless, feeling powerless, and being in pain, the combination of being in intolerable amounts of pain and being shamed for the powerlessness of not being able to do something about it influences the individual hierarchy to first and foremost dispel that shame by gaining a sense of agency and control. The second part of the equation is when you have a larger mass, a group, a family, a church, a culture, abusing a smaller entity, a minority, an individual, a child. When you have two parents abusing a child, you have a phenomena of scale. And as anyone who knows the laws of momentum, the laws of impact understands, that if a 500-pound person playing football runs into a 80-pound person playing football, the 500-pound weight doesn't rebound upon impact. It topples the 100-pound. The semi-truck colliding with a Prius pushes the Prius back and smashes it into smithereens, not the other way around, because there's an issue of mass. So the law of mass says that whenever you have something that's 3, 5, 10 times, at least 5 times bigger than something else, that when they collide, it is inevitable that the larger mass displaces the smaller mass. And so when you have a 5-year-old child in relationship with 2 parents, relative giants, the equivalent of being 30-foot tall, a 30-foot tall gang of 2 people ganging up on us today when we're 6 foot tall, weighing 400 or 500 pounds, it is a giant experience. And so the second phenomena is abuse flowing from a large structure, a school system, a parental system, a governmental system, to a small system, an individual. Now, the abuse creates pain. The large discrepancy in mass creates helplessness. So when you are being abused at gunpoint, again, it creates this imbalance in scale. When you are being abused by a mafia gang that can put out 20 hitmen on you if you tell the truth of what's going on, you've got this phenomena of there's pain, there's abuse, but there's also helplessness. So that's the second part of the component that leads to this phenomena of first prioritizing agency, control, and power, secondly prioritizing pain mitigation. And there's also a functional psychological thing that within the feeling of helplessness and powerlessness is the experience of not being helped and the belief that one cannot do anything about it. You think, well, what if I did this? Well, then this could happen. Or what if I told the truth to the police? Well, then my daughter could be shot. What if I told, what was going on about the sexual abuse? Well, then I could be fired. Well, what if I complained about that? Well, I would still be evicted because, my landlord doesn't care why I'm not paying the rent if I'm fired, etc. And so there's this sense of helplessness because I'm not being helped, because I'm not being understood. And there is a larger mass relating to me, and I don't have the resources to push that off. I can't hire the best attorneys in the country. I can't make a confident case in public about this. I don't own a magazine, etc. So there's a feeling of helplessness, both in the observation of my resources versus the resources of my abuser, and the mass of myself and the mass of the abuser, and the lack of support. There's no ground swelling of support coming around me. I do not believe, based on my observation of what's happening in my reality, that I can be helped. So this equation alone results in a fair amount of self-mutilation, self-punishment, self-abuse. Because when you have this kind of discrepancy in scale, where you're up against an adversary that's 5 or more times bigger than you are, there is a feeling of aggression to counter the helplessness. There's a feeling of anger to counter the despair, to counter the depression, the collapse, because one cannot take care of oneself out of a state of helplessness and a belief that one will not be helped and one cannot succeed. Meaning, when one looks at this situation, one does not believe that the Prius can fight back and get the semi back on the road. It doesn't matter whether the semi is driving on the wrong side of the road, the right side of the road. It doesn't matter if it's rude. There's just this underlying awareness of the physics of mass. That's not right. It doesn't matter. They own the newspaper. They're my boss. They're my parents. That's my government. and I don't agree with it, but if I go head to head and advocate for myself, I believe I will die. I could lose everything. I believe I will be scarred for life. My children could be raped. My business sabotaged. Whatever it is. In a monopoly customer domination sequence, Microsoft is taking over your company, and they're going to destroy you or they're going to buy you. You don't want to sell, but they're going to destroy you or they're going to buy you. And they're going to buy you on their terms, because the threat is, if you don't sell on our terms, we will destroy you. And look at all these small companies that we have destroyed, just to remind you of the fact that we have a 30 billion cash war chest, etc. So you have this dynamic. So if that aggression cannot be safely expressed outside, and one needs to balance the feeling of collapse, despair, and helplessness with response, the aggression is often directed inside. And this is one of the reasons that children will abuse themselves to take out the frustration and the aggression by countering powerlessness and helplessness with agency and control. But since there is not enough mass to stop the abuse, and since there is not enough support to stop the abuse, that aggression is joining the abuse. If I can't feel a sense of control stopping people from hurting me, and every time I try and do that, it gets worse and I feel more and more helpless, I will hurt myself. And there is a certain transcendence, there is a certain statement of, I can take it. I'm not going to collapse into helplessness and despair indefinitely, with the belief, because there's a very important tension going on in this dynamic. Within abuse and ganging up on an individual, on a minority, it could be the Caucasians enslaving the African Americans. They're the minority. We have the money, we have the size, we have the boats, we have the chains, we have the legal system. You don't. So we're going to enslave you. Within the majority, there is a belief. All behavior is consistent with the beliefs of the people enacting that behavior. So you have no value is one of the beliefs. Your beingness, your freedom, your dignity has no value. That's why it makes sense for us to treat you without dignity. So you have a large mass saying you have no value, and you have a small part saying I do have value. But so you have a tension of belief. I have value, no you don't. If every time these two beliefs meet, the dominant mass just collapses the other, there is a feeling of helplessness. Because we all have a narrative. If I'm valuable, then people treat me with respect. Okay, makes sense. Being respectful is consistent with value. So what does respect and value look like? Well, asking permission before chaining my body. And so when people don't ask permission before chaining your body, the message is, no, you don't have value. You may think you have value, but you're wrong. You have no value. What? Why? Why don't I have it? Well, we've decided that your skin doesn't have value. My skin has value, but your skin doesn't have value. Why? Well, I'm making up the rules because I'm valuable. You're not making up the rules because you have no value. So there's a tension of belief. And every abusive interaction has a demeaning belief beneath it. You're not worth it. I'm better than you. You're not important enough to protect. You're not important enough to love. You're unlovable. You're worthless. You're garbage. Whatever the belief is, it is a demeaning belief. It is a debasing belief that takes away the dignity, the respect, the honor of the other human being. And when one holds the belief, I'm valuable, and it's met as if it does not exist, there is a profound violation of a very central and sacred belief, which creates a lot of pain. Pain is the separation from and longing for. I long to be treated with value. That's really important to me. It's central to every human being. It's really important to me. So that's the longing. But I'm being treated as if I have zero value. That's a huge gap. I long to be treated as if I have value. I'm treated as if I have none. They couldn't be further apart. So there's an extraordinary amount of pain. Now, when you are valuable and you enter an extraordinary amount of pain, in a culture that honors your value, you raise a hand and you say, I am in extraordinary amounts of pain. And everyone stops and says, what can we do? How can we help? When you are in a cult environment in which your extraordinary pain is not valuable enough for anyone to stop, it's like, okay, my parents, surely my parents, who say their love and da-da-da, surely my parents are going to stop and do something about this extraordinary pain and indignity. No, they're not, except when it gratifies their ego or something, but pretty much no, they're not going to. Well, certainly my teachers, when they see this, no, they'll give you an A if you do a good essay and whatever, but they're not going to take a stand for your value. My government, if I write a letter, dear government, is there someone who will say that I'm valuable and I'm worth not being bullied, etc.? No, the clerk who gets your letter doesn't really like their job, doesn't value themselves necessarily enough to get a job that they love. Tough luck. And your friends, no, they're busy doing this and that and the other. The church, no, they're not going to say that you are profoundly valuable in this and that and the other. They're going to ask for a donation. We're valuable. Could you give us some money and maybe we'll chat with you a little bit about how life's tough. But no one's going to take a stand at all to say that this is wrong, that I'm valuable, that my enormous pain around this is worth a response from someone. Because if someone responds, then they are saying, even if they're the only one, they're saying, you are in fact valuable. I took time off work, I did this, I did this, I did this. You are valuable. And I'm honored to be here to support what I value, you. When no one shows up, when little Jenny is molested and nobody took the time to learn about her molester, and nobody took the time to notice her face, and nobody saw and honored when she said, please don't leave me alone with this person. I want to stay with you, Mom. Mom said, no, I'm busy. Go be with the abuser. And doesn't take the time to listen. Then when little Jenny says, Uncle Kenny did this, she says, no, Uncle Kenny is a good guy. You be quiet. Because what's valuable is me. I have a busy life. I don't want to take care of you. Uncle Kenny is, the only one who will do it for free, because that's how unvaluable you are. And I don't want to hear anything bad about him unless you can provide me with another free babysitter. You can't? Okay, fine. Go off to Uncle Kenny. And then Uncle Kenny threatens you if you tell the truth, because he doesn't value you either. He doesn't value your truth. He doesn't value your sanity. He doesn't value you getting support for his abuse, because he's more valuable. All of this is communicating the message. You don't have value, you don't have value. Now, the real danger comes in, and this is where self-mutilation and self-harm comes in, is when you assert your value and say, no, I am valuable. And you get a slap in the face by a giant who says, no, you're not. I can throw you away like that. You think you're important? I can burn through people like you all the time. You'll be out in the street in no time. You're nothing except what I choose to give you. You're nothing. You know, the bullying dynamic of a Microsoft, the bullying dynamic of a sexual abuser, the bullying dynamic of the court system. We don't care what your feelings are. Do you have an attorney that filled out this form, or don't you? If you don't, get out of here. You don't matter. Our protocols matter. Your schedule doesn't matter. Our schedule matters. You fit into this system or get the hell out of here. So all of this is a tension of belief. There is something innate in every human being that rises up from the innocence of the soul that says, I matter. I'm beautiful, I'm good. But when that is met by superior mass across the board saying, no, you are not, there is a trauma, because it creates enormous levels of pain. And then as you try and remedy that pain and are met with still more pain, it creates extraordinary levels of helplessness. Why? Because no one's helping. That's what helplessness is. When you feel deeply seen, understood, and supported, you never feel helpless. By definition, people who feel helpless do not feel and experience support and help in the language they can digest that support and help. Now, when we shame people for being powerless with a look, gee, you know, I thought you were a real man. Real men wouldn't have needed that, frankly, but, you know, since you're an inferior man, I'll throw you a few crumbs, you know, but, yeah, I've also lost my respect for you. You know, now you're inferior because in my chauvinistic nature, I believe that the person who helps someone is superior to the person who needs help. So I'll help, just proving my superiority, which of course is another message that you have no value. When you have no value simply because you need help, and you are being dominated by a superior force, well, if you need help and ask for it, you lose value. Or if you are dominated and bullied, you have no value. Because valuable people aren't dominated and bullied. It's too crazy a narrative. I'm a really important person who no one shows up for, who no one respects, including myself, who no one understands, who no one's taken the time to learn, and who could die and nobody would notice. That's how important I am. It's like, no, that's not an important person. That's a worthless person. And the environment says, you betcha, you're worthless. So this is a very, important part in, in understanding why people hurt themselves. To feel powerful, to escape the shame of needing help, and avoid the superiority dynamic within chauvinism. Chauvinism towards men and women. It's often, if you're a man and you are emotionally vulnerable and deeply in need, you can be hit with a lot more shame in our cult than if you're a woman, because we all know women are inferior. They're emotional because they're feminine, right? It's not actually so much of a gender chauvinism as an energetic chauvinism. That which is feminine in women and in men is automatically viewed as inferior to that which is masculine. Mastery, making them pay, doing whatever. Revenge, okay, we'll give you credit for that, but desperately needing help, being confused, not knowing what to do, that doesn't sound like a very high status individual in our cult. We like the ones who win. So if you don't win, you're a loser. And losers aren't valuable. We don't invite losers to dinner. We don't help losers. We punish them because you're not valuable. So it's again and again buffeting the healthy ecosystem within the psyche that says, I am value. It's being hit by all sides on multiple levels. And then it's being hit for being hit. Because when a large force whacks into you with a message that says you have no value, it knocks you over, which means you take a big hit. You're less capable after that hit than before. So now your performance is judged as inferior, which means you're hit again. And you are not asked for help. How can we help? Because that's the obvious thing. How can we help? When you're not asked, how can we help, you're met with helplessness. Okay, so the environment in which this occurs, there's a number of different environmental aspects around this. One of the environments in which this occurs comes in the conflict between a cult and a growing individual. So here's the cult. And our cult sustains systemic unconsciousness in a whole variety of things. As an example, you can go through school, college, work, and relationship without ever knowing what love is. You ask your wife of 20 years, what is love? What does loving you completely and fully look like? I don't know. And for you, what is love? And do they match up? And did you know that that's what the other one meant? I don't know. When you can go through an entire cult life cycle, illiterate about the most basic feminine states of love and connection and belonging, then you have a cult of willful unconsciousness, a cult that is highly focused on certain areas of the psyche and completely dismissive of others. We have this in, the scientific community is completely dismissive of the mystical, the transcendent, that which is unexplained. And so it's a one-way abuse system in the same way that in our chauvinistic system, the competent doctor is usually respected by, in the stereotype of the 50s or so, the wife. But the man, the doctor, is not honoring and respectful of the fact that his wife is more emotionally sensitive, is more artistic than he is. He may say, oh, good, she's a nice little sex object, but we both know who has the real value. And so when you have a dynamic where both people, supported by the culture, say that you are the important one and I'm just a nothing, you have an asymmetry in honor, because the psyche, in its entire probability field, is equally valuable. There have been cults and cultures throughout human history, some that honor wonder, some that honor mysticism, some that honor the unseen world, some that honor compassion, and some that honor creativity and warriorship. And there's a whole range. All of the different archetypes have been honored and emphasized by one cult or another. But whatever your cult honors, in our time and world, there is a part of the psyche's probability field that is invisible, is not honored. And so that's kind of expressed here. where you have whole terrains that are unconscious. For example, in our cult, unlike 90% of the cults in human history, anything metaphysical, transcendent, mystical, anything like that is pretty much passé and, to be tolerated from a position of superiority. And so it's not developed. I mean, you will learn how to combine the material table of elements in a lab, but you will not learn how to combine feelings to create emotional states. Good litmus test: do you know the difference between a feeling and an emotion? 1. 2, did you know there was a difference? 3, can you put the difference into words? And 4, do you think the person next to you would agree with you? That's a pretty basic rudimentary level of emotional literacy, to know the difference between a feeling and emotion. And yet, one can go to therapy, go through the entire cult's sanctioned protocol, and have no idea. In other words, the fact that you don't know that is not saying anything about you. It's saying something about your cult. Because the Eskimos have 400 words for snow, because it's that important to their survival and culture and life. Snow that's wet that's moving towards ice, snow that's wet that's moving towards water, snow that's wet and hardened and wet again and good to ski on. Snow. There's all these different words. We don't know that. It's a terrain that is unconscious. So we could easily disrespect if we went into Eskimo terrain. Oh, it's all snow. I have one word for snow: snow. We're in snow. That's all I know. So I could die not knowing the difference between a snow that's moving towards water and a snow that's moving towards crystal, because I don't know. So one of the things that happens is just the path towards normalcy and convergence, which is particularly high in traumatized cults, leads people to develop, highly in the area that the cult emphasizes. Like, for example, in America, it's independence, it's money, it's masculine traits of assertiveness, leadership, speaking. You'll go to Toastmasters in America and you will not learn a single thing about listening. And it's not saying toast receptacle. Like, the Toastmasters has 2 equal parts: the person giving the toast and making the speech, and everyone listening. And to look at this scientifically, you say, well, would it be intelligent or relevant? Would the toaster have any value if no one was listening to their speech? And the answer is, of course not. If you give a great speech and not a single person hears it, listens, or cares about it, your speech is irrelevant. On the other hand, the audience has an enormous impact. They can pay attention or ignore you. They can follow up. They can allow themselves to be changed by your speech, or they can hold on to their dogmas. The art of listening is a profound art, and you could say it is more important because there are many listeners and one speaker. But you will not learn the art of listening in a chauvinistic culture. You will learn the art of speaking, because speaking is masculine. And so when a culture divides itself and says, these are what we are going to develop in our people, and these other things, they're so unimportant, we're just not going to bother. When an individual grows outside of the bounds of its cult, the only place to grow is into the domains that are unconscious and thus dishonored by the cult. Now, this creates an environment ripe for pain, ripe for violation, ripe for abuse. Let's say that because we understand materialism, because we're a materialist cult. Let's say that your body was cut in half and your left half was completely numb and invisible. It didn't show up to anyone around you. No one could see it because their eyes were trained to see your right half. Now, the left half is inferred because you couldn't really walk and be balanced without a left and a right half. But if everyone is trained into numbness and unconsciousness and ignoring that part or patronizing it and just diminishing it, then they're going to violate it. They're going to dishonor it with words. They're going to dishonor it with superiority. They're going to dishonor it with insensitivity. They're going to dishonor it by banging into it as if it doesn't exist. And it will create pain, but it's anesthetized. It's unconscious, so you're not dealing with the pain. If you take a pain blocker that blocks your left side every single day, and every time you start to feel a little pain, you just take another pain blocker, then you're not going to be dealing with the actual pain of the violation in yourself and in other people. Now, let's say someone stops taking the pain blocker. Someone says, that doesn't sound right. If a speaker is important, then a listener is important. If a man is important, then a woman is important. In part, there wouldn't be any men if there weren't women. I mean, just basic physics. If a leader is important, how is a leader important if there aren't followers and good followers? What if there are followers that don't know the difference between a good leader and a bad leader? Following, the art of following and knowing when to follow and when to lead, when to talk and when to listen, that's an incredibly sophisticated and important art. But I'm not learning that. When an individual develops awareness and honor in themselves for something that is culturally denigrated, violated, and unconscious, it creates a predisposition of pain. So cults are always changing. There have been 10,000 cults in human history. They're almost all dead because most cults will hang to their dogma to the last and die rather than adapt and change. But when new consciousness is born, when development is occurring, a very small number of people are moving into psychic terrain, into terrain in their psyche that everyone has, but the rest of the cult is ignoring it. And this creates an incredibly difficult thing. For example, when you're developing, if you're a Monet and you're developing impressionist paintings, and the entire world tells you you are an idiot, but this is where your heart is, there's going to be pain. Because if the entire world says, hey, you're Monet, you're developing a new style of painting, you're wonderful, this is incredible, keep it up, here, let's buy your art at high prices so you have lots of paint and time to ruminate, you are important. You're not going to feel violated. You're not going to feel pain. You're not going to feel helpless. But if you are Monet at the beginning of the Impressionist movement, you feel something and everyone tells you you're shit. You still feel something and nobody buys the painting. You do something else and it's like the more you honor that part of yourself, the more abuse, the more criticism, the more dishonor, the more disrespect. Someone buys a painting and says, this is a good canvas, I'll paint over it. And it's the water lilies, it's a Monet. But it's a Monet in a cultural landscape in which no one values a Monet. Because we don't yet know how. It takes forerunners to evolve a cult. So when consciousness is born and you develop awareness in a domain that your family doesn't value, doesn't acknowledge, hates, punishes, attacks, you will feel extraordinarily high levels of pain because you acknowledge it and it's being hurt. It's not being loved and honored. Now, when you express the love and honor for something that no one else can understand and see and love, you will be hurt again. That idiot. What does he think? Weird impressionist paintings? What kind of fool? He's an idiot. Of course we don't honor it. You're dumb for expecting us to honor it. So this dynamic creates potential for abuse. Now, the other kind of similar exploration is, every cult has sacredness. We value money almost above human beings in many cases, and so we're valuing money. But what if you value free time in a cult that values money? So the cult says, gee, I'll drop and do just about anything if I can get money. But you decide that bits of paper are not where it's all at, that free time, that spontaneity, that's where the joy is. That's where the life that sings your soul lives. So you're in a different part of the psyche, honoring at the center of your life something that no one else values. Because in a cult, for example, that likes to keep busy, under the idea that that's productive, under the idea that that will make lots of money, then when you're spontaneous and spacious, you are automatically low ranking. Because the cult looks at you through its own eyes, it doesn't look at you through its eyes. And it certainly doesn't look at itself through your eyes. It's again the majority in tension with the minority. So when sacred down here is keeping busy and making money, and sacred for you personally is spontaneity and free time, now you are automatically made what you value 10, 20, 30 times a day is treated as unimportant. And what you do not value, you are expected to pivot around if you want any cooperation from the majority of people around you. This is again saying what is sacred to you doesn't matter. Now, we identify with what is most sacred to us. We say, that's me. What makes my heart sing, that's what's sacred. So if we identify with something that everyone else doesn't value, it's incredibly difficult to get buffeted thousands of times, in a month by a news media that doesn't value it, by our friends that don't value it, by work environments that don't value it, by our city. It hasn't even occurred to it that it is valuable, and yet it's valuable to us. So this is, the next environment. Now, when consciousness is born, when change is occurring, it is always a potent group of minority, a Manet, that brings about change. If there were no people like Monet, there would never have been the Impressionists. If there were no people like, Pollock or whatever, there would never have been, various aspects of the modern movement. Monet would have loved the Impressionists, but he might have completely dismissed Pollock. Dribbles and drabs, that's not where it's at. And so the key comes when you have radical pivots and change in consciousness at high levels of excellence, when someone devotes their life to creating high levels of excellence in a domain that no one else gives a shit, one, that no one else can imagine could be valuable, two, and consequence is tremendously dishonoring and disrespectful, it will create vast amounts of pain. In a chauvinistic cult, when that pain presents itself, it will be humiliated and shamed rather than loved and honored, thus creating helplessness and pain, leading to the number one thing to create control and power, self-mutilation, self-pain, and secondly, only pain mitigation. The other environments are kind of spoken just in another way. So we have, the environment in the culture of shame and powerlessness. This is conducive for self-mutilation. Emotional trauma and psychological illiteracy is conducive to self-harm. Scarcity fear, which leads to sociopathic strategy, is conducive to abuse. Meaning, when you're surrounded by people who are afraid of not having enough money, for example, and you have this great epiphany or this or that, and something's been done wrong, and it's very bad, and you're trying to bring this gift out, and everyone's afraid and feels scarce. The general response is to be incredibly sociopathic. When everyone is incredibly sociopathic, What it means is you're in pain and nobody cares. No one pivots around your pain. The message again, you have no value. The belief there is not enough. The belief that there is not enough generally leads to realities in which there is not enough, because pain and trauma and fear are viral in nature. If you do not heal someone in trauma, in pain, and fear when they present themselves, as a general rule, they traumatize and frighten other people. And if you don't respond to that, then they do it to others until eventually you are infected with the virus. And when you act out of fear, you are acting out of a belief that is faulty. You're acting out of a belief. There's not enough, there's this, there's that, all this stuff. And it's very difficult to create the synergies and partnerships needed to create vast amounts of abundance and release the potential of your team, your neighborhood, your species, your town, when you're all operating in the myopia of fear. Lack of skill to honor transcendent truths is another part of the environment that leads to self-mutilation. Because when we don't learn what transcendent truths are, and we don't learn how to honor them, then when someone presents a transcendent truth or presents a face of soul, a face of psyche, we don't know how to honor it. And again, when we're ashamed for not knowing, part of chauvinism, I don't know how to do this, what we often do is abandon the person we don't know how to honor. Like someone dies, and we say, oh my gosh, I'm in a cult that doesn't treat us, that has given me zero information on how to honor someone whose mother just died. At kindergarten, they didn't sit me down. My parents didn't sit me down. In middle school, they didn't sit me down. In high school, in college, no one ever sat me down in this cult and said, this is what death and dying is like. This is why it happens. This is the range of states that people go through. This is the grief cycle of, pain and denial and anger and bargaining. And no one ever sat me down and said this. So I'm in yet another area psychologically illiterate. In the wound of my cult denied this data. I don't know what to do. But in a cult that shames me for not knowing what to do and rewards me for being confident and cocky, I don't want to admit that I don't know what to do and lose status. So what I do when I don't know how to be a friend to someone who just lost someone significant is I avoid them. And I communicate in doing so the message, you don't matter. Because my image, I don't want to feel awkward. And if I had to ask you, you're really important to me, and I don't know what I'm doing here, and I'd love your help in how to be around you since you've lost someone important, and I want to be a good friend to you. So how do I do it? Now, I could easily do that. That takes 4 minutes. Now, everyone who hears that appreciates it. There isn't anyone that I know who, when you say, you're important to me, I don't know what I'm doing, I want to express my value to you and support you, and I don't know how. Does that offend anyone? Now, of course not. Music to so many people's ears. Why? Because no one's ever heard that. Has anyone ever come up to you in this cult? Now, in other intelligent cults, not only would it happen all the time, but they don't even need to do that because they have grief classes. 2 certainties in life, death and taxes. Okay, you're going to prepare me for life, right? Okay, prepare me to help people die. No. We're going to prepare you for life. We're going to prepare you to be a complete putz and idiot when it comes to people dying, of which they absolutely will. But we're just going to dishonor the elderly as much as possible as part of our chauvinism, because they're not very important, because elderly people don't make as much money as young people, so they can just die miserable deaths in our cult. And you will be a part of that because you won't know what you're doing, because we'll be busy teaching you algebra and other things that you'll never use. And so I've never heard that in my life. No American in my entire life has ever said, "You're really valuable. I don't know what I'm doing. Please help me know what I'm doing so that you know from my behavior how important you are." Zero. 10,000 interactions, zero. Could almost anyone in all 10,000 interactions have done it better? Absolutely. But in a chauvinistic culture where you are shamed for not knowing, where you are shamed for needing, where you are shamed for not pretending to be cocky and all that, nobody wants to ask the simple question. And so what happens is people going through enormous pain and transition are surrounded by emotionally illiterate, uneducated fools who are determined not to admit they're fools and will never ask in a million years how they can help. So they all abandon you when you need love and belonging around trauma. You feel like complete shit and valueless, and then they get defensive that this had anything to do with them because it's all about them and their image. And you feel shitty and valueless again. And it weakens relationships, and it creates bitterness and cynicism, as any chemist would predict in the science of feelings. So lack of skill to honor transcendent truths is key to perpetuating this valueless cycle. And the other is materialism and egotism. And this is really important in a number of levels, because a lot of the abuse in developing countries is on an emotional level. But heavy materialism, emotions don't matter. They're the enemy of science, the enemy of this, because they're feminine. And they don't contribute to, theories or whatever. We don't care about what you feel. What we want to know is what you think. And this is expressed, a million different ways in our cult, where people are asked to, for example, put their emotions on display on television, and the interviewers don't say, "Wow, how can I help? Does it feel okay to be in front of national television talking about this? How can I help? I feel really bad about this. Me too, I've had that." Does the interviewer focus on empathizing with the person whose emotions are on display, or do they focus on performing and showing how sociopathic they are by demonstrating how they have absolutely no feeling and this is my job, and then just push the person out on the street, whether they're overwhelmed, traumatized or not? Just off you go. I've used you for my purposes. You've been interesting in my show. And oh, that's an interesting point. I remember talking about suicide to my family. And in over 8 hours, not a single family member empathized with a feeling. They argued about ideas, they debated points, they said this was interesting and that it was interesting, but very, very carefully made sure that no feeling was honored, other than the fear of having feelings. That was constantly coming up. Don't have that feeling, you shouldn't have that feeling, you shouldn't have that feeling. That's what an emotionally illiterate cult does and looks like. So in the materialism that is part of chauvinism, feelings aren't material, so they don't matter. Just stuff in your head. Doesn't matter. And egotism is another issue, because when you are in an egotistical cult, your entire identity and your value is measured by the you that you think you are right now and the you that other people think you are right now. All you are is a homeless person. All you are is a poor person. All you are is an addict. You're a criminal. You're this. And that's all you are. You're materialistically viewed as this ego this time. Now, when you are hit with overwhelming abuse, with superior mass, in an emotionally and psychologically illiterate cult, when you are hit with beliefs of profound valuelessness, when you are in a cult of profound unconsciousness, abuse is inevitable, pain is inevitable, feelings of helplessness are inevitable, and the ego cannot deal with it. The ego can't deal with it. The ego needs love and belonging, not hate from all these people. And now, when the ego is fixated on the material plane, in a cult that is profoundly abusive, there's no answer. There's complete helplessness. Those bastards will do this. It's complete helpless. There's no point. And the ego gives up in despair, rage, helplessness. Why do this? Anger, all of this. Because that is a logical conclusion to these equations for a materialistic ego. Maybe they decide to be sociopathic and win at the game. Maybe they give up. Maybe they become cynical. That's where a lot of egos end up. Now, the solution is not anywhere in this environment. The solution is in the domain of transcendence, because outside of the ego, outside of physicality in this time and space, is a series of dimensions, one that we can't measure. We can only track the dimensions that we have sensory and observing measuring devices to track. And like every good egotist, we want to pretend that the multiverse is only as big as the dimensions we have the capacity to observe and measure. And we need to feel that, because otherwise we might be dwarfed by just how small and uncertain so many things are. We get our sense of certainty and thus safety from saying there's nothing exists but what I can see. Louis Pasteur dealt with that when he discovered germs. Why were people dying in the 1800s or so when surgeons would saw off and amputate, and then they would die from an infection? But they couldn't see germs at the time, and they were good egotistical materialists, and so of course germs didn't exist because they couldn't see them. It wasn't until the microscope. I see. Now I see. Now they can be real because I can see them. I have an observing and measuring device, and so they're real because I could see them. But were they real before the microscope was invented? Did germs exist before the microscope existed? And the same existential question can be asked, does the dimension of ping exist before you have a ping observer? Does the dimension of Lulu exist before you have an observing and measuring device that calibrates frequencies of energy on the dimension called Lulu? And does that shift based on the nature of your observing and measuring devices? If you have colorblind eyes, is reality still colorful or not? And so there's a tremendous amount of egocentric materialism that wants to say that all we are or ever will be are what these little observing measuring devices see, and that's it. Now, when all those parts see are large objects that say you're a piece of shit and you're not worth protecting and you're not worth valuing, and what you love about and care about the most is not even on the cult radar, and you will be punished for honoring it and called weird, blah, 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 blah. And that's where your heart is. You're a Monet, and that part of you want to develop it. But no one's buying that. No one's honoring that. And it's happening again and again. You can feel worthless and like it's all me. It's all my fault that I'm in a cult where nobody values this. Now, transcendence comes when you have this underlying belief tension. And then you move outside of the set, becoming aware of the awareness that is looking through into this particular video arcade and playing with these particular avatars, and realize there's a part of me that connects with a much bigger part of me. This is just one of the games. I'm more valuable than the game that I'm in. The fact that there's a bunch of bad guys lining up to shoot off everything every time I cross this area, I have to figure out how to jump over that. But that does not make me a worthless person. When we transcend the set of materialistic, chauvinistic cult thinking and step outside of that into the probability field of all human potential and start scanning in that terrain like, I would like a cult more like this, and I'd like a cult more like that, and I'd like a cult that did this. Because this is how change happens in any cult. If Manet had just done the first Impressionist painting, was told it was a piece of shit, he should go back to painting real landscapes, and said, you're right, what do I know? And put down his brush and tried to be a crappy, other type of painter, out of fear. Well, we wouldn't have the Impressionists, and we wouldn't have that terrain. If someone who's incredibly sensitive and exploring this area of the psyche and is told they're an idiot and and they're never going to make any money, and they just put down their brush, the cult never expands. You can tell how much a cult loves itself by how it treats its minorities, because its minorities are always the fringe of its future. Every bleeding edge technology starts off with one or two people who believe in it and lead the way for everyone else. Everyone else tries to generally shut them up about it. No, people will never fly. Stop building those ridiculous airplanes. If God meant people to fly, he would have, built people with wings. He didn't. You're never going to fly. Whatever the disbelief is, as all innovation goes through the period of disbelief, anger, insanity, denial, etc. And then, here we are. Everyone's doing it. And so in many ways, if you understand that this is a cult that does not love itself very well, because it is built up of human beings in a materialist, chauvinistic, egotistical culture that does not love itself very much, then you can understand that the cult is generally hostile towards minorities as harbingers of change and possible chaos and fear of the unknown, and that we, as new parts come up in each of us, are often afraid, oh my gosh, how am I going to pay the rent if I follow that part of me? How am I going to do this? Oh my gosh, you're the enemy because you're ruining the status quo. I don't know how to integrate this part of me into my life, so you're the enemy. So it's no wonder everyone's ganging up and saying you're bad, you are, and I'm going to join in the fray to murder the new faces of soul, the new faces of psyche that are coming up spontaneously. In the ever, nature hates a vacuum, and nature is always changing. We're part of a larger ecology. And so the process is to step out and to connect, first of all, with the belief that whether or not our cult is capable in its belief structure, etc., to love us, that our cult is a very, very tiny speck in the universe, and that somewhere in the multiverse there are places and cults and beings, somewhere in the timescape there are places and cults and beings in which our most beautiful and positive self is loved, adored, wanted, and that we are moving towards that. Maybe not in this cult, and there the ability to change culture. For example, I often go abroad where I enjoy being celebrated for parts of me that are criticized in my own cult. So, you can find another environment. There's not just one cult on the planet, thank goodness. There are cults that actually like to dance. There are cults that like to play. There are cults that are more spontaneous. There are cults that are more emotionally sensitive. And if those are what you're trying to develop, you can go there and get a feeling for, yes, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just in a cult that doesn't know how to deal with me. There are cults that love homosexuals, but not this one. So, where do we go where intelligent people are more honoring than the people around us? And so that's part of that. But, in a more metaphysical sense, to understand that we are surrounded by vast amounts of energy with way more amplitude, way more mass and force than we can possibly digest. And within all the different spectrums and dimensions in which energy can exist, and in the probability and possibility set theory, if you can imagine it, it exists somewhere in some time. And if you understand ecological thinking, there is a connection between everything. There is a connection between every time. There's a connection between every dimension. There's a connection between every object in an ecological field. And so it does exist if we can imagine it, and we can connect with it if we can imagine it. And what we feel the most intensely about is what is most real for us and what we move towards. Thus, the connection with divine beings, God, Goddess, all that is, helpers, angels, this personality, that loves and celebrates us as who we are. And the depth of feeling in relationship to that can nurture and bring us into a place of empowerment where we don't need to harm ourselves because we feel so helpless to stop the harm of others, but rather can open up to the healing, to the loving of ourselves in the knowing and believing in the loving of the divine, that which transcends our cult set, the energy that is just outside the observing and measuring devices. And in doing so, in creating an inner reality in which we are deeply and fully honored and loved as we are, which we are completely understood, in which we are supported and connected with. That hate, that bitterness, that fear, that smallness, that belief that I don't matter. Because going back to the belief thing, if you believe you don't matter, all of your behavior will stem from that belief, and it will be destructive behavior. Because people who don't matter and who believe they don't matter don't eat well. They don't sleep well. They don't take care in their education. They don't take care in their finances. They don't invest in their relationships, because why would pieces of garbage who believe they are pieces of garbage invest in a brilliant life? It just doesn't make sense. We seek integrity. So when this mass dominance violates and gives this message, this is worthless, and no one around comes to the rally and we can't challenge that, and we say, okay, fine, I'm worthless. The alternative is to transcend, to understand, no, I am surrounded by people who do not know how to value this in themselves, and so they don't know how to value it in me. Their loss and my pain around that. But I'm also surrounded with infinite dimensions and energy that absolutely celebrate this becoming, celebrate the becoming and development of the species, that rejoice with every Monet, with every new development, with every trend, with every new voice, as part of the cacophony of diversity and beauty that, like nature, has done for billions of years. Nature creates new species and adaptations and stuff all the time, responding to the environment, and we are part of that journey. And it's a journey that works. Nature's still here. Even if this planet goes up in smoke, nature will still be here with another billion planets. And so in pivoting away from that to a much larger set, and in pivoting away from the materialistic ego consciousness that identifies with what other people do and don't see and do to me here, we have the chance to play within a paradigm that's a little bit more playful, because it's more of a game. This is my avatar. These are my sensory things. That's what I know in this reality. But I'm also the one looking into the game. I'm the one watching the screen. Okay? I died this one. What's the game? What's my... maybe I'm trying to mitigate pain. Maybe I'm figuring out how to realize my potential. Maybe I'm figuring out how to love people around me and help them grow into people capable of loving me. What's my game? And how do I score my points? Because in this game, we get to define what the rules are. Now, of course, we'll be told these are the rules and you can only think this way and that way is bad. And we have the freedom to believe it or not. particularly when we reference the energies, the transcendent energies outside the set. And so the answer to emotional illiteracy is to become emotionally literate, to understand the difference between feelings and emotions, to understand the chemistry, how this feeling and this feeling interacts with this environment to create this feeling, and how this feeling repeated multiple times becomes this emotion. How and what are the meanings and beliefs that interact with this environment to create this feeling, this emotion? What are the narratives? How does this sensation combine with this belief to create this thought? What's figuring it all out? And so we can become more literate. We can transform beliefs in scarcity with a reminder that we have so much energy around us all the time that we can't possibly, integrate it. There is so much abundance we can't possibly process it, and that's why we've separated ourselves from the vastness of energy, and we've narrowed it down to these tiny little inputs of a little bit of energy in a very small part of the time-space continuum, but it's everywhere. We can learn the skill to honor ourselves and learn the skill to honor others. We can transcend materialism and egotism as dogmas, meaning we have an ego and we have material. What we're transcending is the dogma that you are nothing but your ego, and the dogma that if you can't see it, the germs don't exist. And saying reality is always vastly bigger than we can imagine. One of the most magical things in these journeys is experiencing the transformation between helplessness and being helped. Not necessarily by other human beings, but in dreams, in landscapes, in poetry, to have transcendent energy just come in and move things around and be helped in a very deep and meaningful way. It's a powerful pivot point. But it begins with believing that reality is vastly bigger than any cult, that we are bigger than the avatars in which we interact with this lifetime. That non-physical reality is as valid and important as physical reality. That non-egotistical identity is as valid and important as egotistical identity. That the other is as valuable as here. And that we're on a journey, a growing journey, in a tough game, learning through pain, learning through fear, etc., but not limited to it.